So this presentation is called The Heart of Great Achievement, and I was actually asked to put this together for the Leaders Conference in Southampton in 2022. And since I presented it there, I've done it in multiple regions across the UK. I've been lucky enough to do it to different countries around the world. And in November last year, I presented this at the Global Convention in Singapore. And I always start the same way, which is by telling you that this is only half of the story. So the quote, "The Heart of Great Achievement," is actually one half of a story from someone that I consider to be one of the greatest leadership gurus of all time. And that's a gentleman called John C. Maxwell. And if you're a leader in anything, and we're all leaders here, so if we're business owners, entrepreneurs, if we're at managerial level, if we're parents, if we're doing anything at all, we need to display leadership skills. And one of the kind of Bibles for leadership skills is The 5 Levels of Leadership by John Maxwell. And he's gone on to write many, many others. I start my day with a daily leadership quote from John Maxwell. It's a great book to start your day with. It's just one quote a day, all about leadership. And the full quote for this is, "The truth is that teamwork is at the heart of great achievement." So right at the heart of absolutely everything we do, there needs to be teamwork. So, and that was a subject that I was kind of thrown almost in a blasé fashion by the conference organizing committee for Southampton. It's like, yeah, can you just kind of do something about teamwork? And the big problem was, when we talk about teamwork, the first thing we need to do is cut through all of the cliches, because there's a lot of cliches around teamwork. And I'm going to run through a few. And I just want to see, I need to see kind of like almost musical theatre reactions if you've seen this stuff, because you're tiny on my screen right now. So if you're laughing, it needs to be kind of that. And like if you're agreeing, it needs to be a proper nod. So the first cliche is, teamwork makes the dream work. Yeah. Okay. So thank you for nodding along. I first heard this when my brother came back from working at McDonald's in 1998. So that was like what his shift manager used to say to him. And just for reference, who's got 2 thumbs and is the only person ever to be turned down for a job at McDonald's? This guy. So that's one of the accolades on my CV. So teamwork makes the dream work. That's cliche number 1. Let's get out of that. And we love an acronym in B&I, don't we? So team apparently stands for Together Everyone Achieves More. Have we heard that one? Yeah, I think some. No, okay, learning experience for some of us. So write it down if you like it. Then there's this one. There's no I in team. But then some really clever people say, Greg, there's no I in team, but there is a me. And I'm like, you can't have that, because for there to be a me, we need to take letters out and switch stuff around. So that means if there's a me in team, because you're all from Yorkshire, that means there's a nice cup of tea in team as well. And if you were from across the border, across the Pennines, that also means there'd be a lot of meat in team. And I'm not sure I want to be in a team with a lot of meat in it. That's just a little bit weird. But then the really clever people point out that there is the I in team. It's right there. But those people I tend to find hang around the a-hole anyway. So let's not try to be clever about teamwork. And let's just cut out all of the cliches and get right to it. Now, Andrew's just humbling introduction there. Thank you so much for that. And we were saying just before I came on the call, I much prefer if people put together an intro and then I kind of get a good idea of what they think about me. And I couldn't have been more humbled with that intro. And Andrew mentioned the fact that I'm kind of known as the story fella. So I thought the best way to demonstrate how powerful teamwork was to go and find some stories about it. So this afternoon, if it's all right with you guys, I'm going to tell you 3 incredible stories about teamwork. They really, really inspired me, and they really kind of illustrated why teamwork was so important. But then I'm going to give you some kind of science behind why we need teamwork in our life. So if that's going to be a good use of your time, just give me a nod or a thumbs up or whatever you do. Brilliant. Thank you very much. So I found these 3 stories. I kind of went out into the world and looked for the greatest examples of teamwork. And they were kind of all put together, and there was no other way of organizing them other than chronological. So we're going to start right at the beginning. We're going to start in where you often find really good examples of teamwork, which is in the theatre of war. And then I'm going to take you up to closer to current day. So this is what they call a PT boat. So this is a patrol torpedo boat, and they are part of the American fleet. They had hundreds of these things. And on April the 1st, 1943, they were operating in the Blackett Strait, which is just south in the Solomon Islands. And they had about 120 of these spread out in a grid formation, and they were looking for something called the Tokyo Express. Now that's a bit weird, right? That's clearly a boat on water, and they're looking for a train called the Tokyo Express. But the Tokyo Express was actually the name that the American troops had given to this just relentless convoy of Japanese supply ships. And they were flanked either side by Japanese destroyers, and their whole purpose was to keep the front line supplied with ammunition, with food, with new vehicles, with weapons, with men, to kind of halt the Allied advance across the South Pacific. But weather really wasn't with them on the 1st of August, and there was low cloud cover, there was no moon, there was no natural light. And by about 2 a.m., the majority of the fleet did what was procedure for the US Navy, and they turned around and went back to restock and resupply and to rest. And they left 4 boats out, and they spread far and wide across the straits, just seeing if they could pick up any sight or sound of the Tokyo Express, because they knew that if they could delay, damage, or destroy just one of these supply ships, it would save hundreds, if not thousands, of Allied lives. So it was worth him staying out there. Just after 2 a.m., PT 109, who had a very young lieutenant called Jack right at the helm, looked over on his starboard bow, and he saw a silhouette in the distance. And initially he thought it was one of the other PT boats, and they had got lost on their grid pattern. But then perspective began to work against him, and the silhouette grew and grew and grew. And out of the darkness came the Amaguri, which was a Japanese destroyer. Now, Jack tried to do what was instinct for him. He tried to swing the bow of the vessel to face the incoming destroyer so it could release the torpedoes alongside and hopefully destroy this ship. But there just wasn't enough time. And the Amaguri cut through PT 109 like a hot knife through butter, and actually sent all of the crew flying into the water. Now, it was pitch black, but of the 13 crew, 2 died on impact. And there was another one, the head mechanic, Mahoney, who was under the deck at the time, and he was totally overcome by fumes and virtually unconscious. He was kind of drifting in and out of consciousness. So they did what was instinct to them. They put their life jackets on, they climbed back onto the wreckage. But as dawn began to break, they could see that the 2 parts of the wreckage were taking on a lot of water and were about to sink. So they abandoned the craft and they jumped into shark-infested water. Now, there were 11 men remaining, and Jack looked around and could see that there were 2 or 3 islands in the distance on the horizon, about 6 or 7 miles away. And he knew he could swim this. You see, when he was at college, he actually swam at a college level, and so did one of the other guys in his crew. But the problem is, out of the 11 men that left, 1 was unconscious and 2 couldn't swim at all. They'd joined the US Navy and they couldn't swim at all. And the rest of them had kind of varying levels of swimming ability. So Jack had this choice. Was it every man for themselves, or did he find a way of getting everyone to safety? So they started lashing together some of the splinters of wood from the wreckage, some of the ones that were floating around, and they used They used some of the bindings from the life jackets to kind of make a makeshift raft, and they loaded the 2 non-swimmers onto the raft. Then 7 of the men, led by the strong swimmer, then towed the raft through reefs and rapids to try to get to this island. Jack himself took one of Mahoney's life jacket straps and put the buckle between his teeth and towed him while swimming until they got to the very first island in the chain. Now, Jack collapsed face down in the waves on this island, but in a wonderful example of Giver's game, Mahoney had regained consciousness and just enough strength to turn him over and to drag him up the beach, placing him under a palm tree so that he could shade and get some rest. But there was a problem on this island. You see, this first island is actually known as Fig Pudding Island. Now that sounds lovely, right? Fig Pudding Island. However, the men didn't name it Fig Pudding Island. The men named it Bird Poo Island, but they didn't use the word poo. And the reason they named it that was because there were thousands of migratory birds nesting on this island, and there was so much guano over all of the bushes, it actually looked like it had snowed. That's how bad it was. But what they did is they split down naturally into teams. So you had a lookout team keeping an eye out for enemy craft. You had a signaling team looking out for allied vessels to see if they could flag them down. You then had teams looking for food, looking for water, and people tending to the injured. But very soon it became apparent that there was no fresh water on this island, and any food had been eaten by all these thousands of birds. So again, they loaded up the raft. Jack put the straps between his teeth and towed Mahoney to island number 2. Again, against them, no food, no fresh water, but they split into teams, had a look, some rested, some searched the island until they decided, right, third and final island in this mini archipelago. So they set out for one last time. Now, when they got to the third island, an island called Nauru, they found fresh water, but they also found new danger. You see, on the reef just outside, just on the edges of the island, on the shallows, there was actually a crashed, a wrecked Japanese convoy ship. And what they could see around the wreck of the ship was that there were 2 islanders scavenging this wreck. Now, they didn't know whether or not that these were friend or foe. And in fact, the islanders, the local fishermen, caught sight of the 11 men and quickly jumped in their tin canoe and started to row away. But what was amazing is they circled back around and made contact with the crew of PT-109. And it turns out that they were island scouts for the Allies, but neither one of the parties knew that at the time of contact. These island scouts offered to get a message to the local commander and actually showed Jack how to scribe his message onto the skin of a green coconut. And the message read, Nauru Island commander, native knows position, he can pilot, 11 alive, need small boat, Jack. And they put their chance of survival into the hands of strangers. And these guys rowed off into the distance in their tin canoe. But they did what they said they were going to do. They got the coconut, they got the message into the hands of an Australian Coast Guard, who then gave it to the commander of the local naval base. The commander didn't know if this was a trick, a trap, some kind of subterfuge. So they gave it to another young lieutenant called William, who later on in life described this moment where he realized he was either the most qualified boat on the fleet or the most expendable. And through a number of dummy meetups, signaling Jack and William finally met. And the exchange went like this. Jack said, "Where the hell have you been?" And William said, "It's all right, we had to stop and get you some food." And Jack said, "No, thanks. I've just had a coconut." So all 11 men that went into the water alive that night survived because people came together and worked as a team. They realized that no one was going to be able to do it on their own, so they split down into shifts, allocated tasks and roles, and kept one another's morale up. And even the beautiful example where Jack, who could be seen as the hero of the story by towing Mahoney through rapids and reefs in shark-infested waters, when he collapsed face down in the surf, Mahoney jumped up, turned him over, and dragged him up the beach. It just shows that when you do great things happen for you in return. And sometimes the problem we have is some of these teamwork examples can be lost to the mists of time. So once war is over, some of the lessons that have been learned just kind of dissipate into society. So when a young American president, JFK, was trying to galvanize a post-war nation behind a common goal, he looked at his own military service and tried to work out the organizations that would have carried those teamwork models forward. Because you see, what often happens is the leadership that's formed in the theater of war then goes into private and government enterprise and organizations after war has ended. So who did he choose? Well, he chose NASA. He knew that a lot of the hierarchy from the military had gone into NASA leadership as well. So he chose NASA to be the voice of his vision. And that vision was to send a man to the moon. And this is a screenshot from that incredibly famous speech, "We choose to go to the moon." And he said, "We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they're easy, but because they are hard, because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one we are willing to accept and one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too." And that whole speech is incredible. It seems to go on for ages, but he delivered it with such passion and conviction that everyone that viewed it on telly and in the arena that day were behind him. But here's the thing, when you put your heart on your sleeve like that, when you know your colors to the mast, you don't actually know if people are going to follow you. So imagine how amazing he felt when he was touring a NASA facility and he went up to a janitor who was mopping the floor and said, "Hi, what do you do here?" Now, it's quite obvious what he does. He's a janitor who's mopping the floor. But the janitor looked up and said, "Mr. President, we're sending a man to the moon." You see, at that moment, he knew he had picked the right organization. He knew that if every person in this vast machine of a company, if every cog in the machine, if every small wheel understood the common vision, you see, that janitor knew that by doing his job right, by keeping the workspaces clear and free of clutter, that the mathematicians and the commanders and the engineers could do their jobs effectively, and ultimately it would lead to that common vision coming true. And in 1969, when we heard those incredible words as Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon, people from around the world were tuned in to a live broadcast for the first time. And I've already said that when we see teamwork, it inspires others. And hundreds of thousands of people were tuning in. And in that number on that night was a very young Steve Jobs. And Steve Jobs was fascinated by all the computers, all the dials, all the sounds that you could hear. But one thing kept catching his eye. And it was a hand-painted banner which just read teamwork above all of the monitors on mission control. There's a very famous interview in 1998 with Steve Jobs. He's just come back to Apple after being fired as CEO in the 80s. And it's about the time where the first iPod would have been developed and changing the way that we not only listen to music, but also purchase it. And that then led to the iPhone. And all of this stuff was going around in his head at the time. And during the interview, which if you want to see it, is called Rise of an Empire, Triumph of the Geeks. The interviewer asks him, what's the most important quality in a company? And he tells the story about seeing this banner on the night of the moon landing and saying that how he believes teamwork is the very highest quality. He then goes on to tell a story about a rock tumbler. And it's a story that we tell all over the world in BNI now when we inspire members to work together. You see, it's not about one or two big rocks. It's about all of the rocks were coming together with a little bit of grit and a little bit of time and taking what can be dusty, lifeless pieces of gravel and turning them into these precious stones and yielding amazing results. And Steve did this the whole time in his career. He knew that collaboration was better than competition. This is him with Google executives having lunch with Larry Page and Eric Schmidt. Now, this broke the internet at the time because apparently these guys were meant to be competition. But Steve Jobs used to use a lunch break as an example and an opportunity to break bread with people. So he would sit down and learn about them and what they were going through. He would share his challenges. And through common knowledge, whether they were part of your company or your competitor, you actually found answers to any adversity you were facing. But even that wasn't original thought for Steve Jobs. You see, that first came from Buck's Restaurant, one of the longest established eateries in Silicon Valley. And early engineers from Sun Systems and from IBM and latterly from Microsoft and Apple would come together for a coffee, a rack of ribs, a beer, a milkshake. And they would say, hey, I'm having this problem with this system. And you would often find that it was people not even in your own department, but not even in your own company that would overcome that challenge for you. They'd give you a different way of thinking. So by sitting down and speaking to one another, when you are removed from the situation, you can overcome absolutely anything. And that's what we do in BNI, isn't it? Sometimes there are people who are 2, 3, 4 steps ahead of us on exactly the same journey, and they give us that new idea. And it was so important to Steve that when he redesigned the Pixar headquarters after buying an old Del Monte canning factory, he put all of the common spaces in the middle of the room. So yes, there was a spot for the accounts and the management. Yes, there was a spot for the computer engineering. And yes, there was a spot for the storyboards and the artists. But the restrooms, the restaurants, the gift shop, the meeting rooms, even the chill out zone was in this massive central atrium, which you can see there. And 3 great examples of how that worked was during a Bring Your Child to Work day. One of the accounts team had his son playing on the floor whilst he ate lunch. And one of the storyboard artists noticed that they weren't just pushing around toys on the floor. Every one of these toys had their own personality and their own backstory. And when I first tell this, people are like, oh, right, that's where Toy Story came from. No, because what he was playing with was Hot Wheel cars. And that's when Lightning McQueen and Mater was born in the head of the storyteller. There was also one of the storybook artists who sat down at the table with a computer engineer. And he said, we've got a real problem with this movie we're making on. The main character is meant to have this relationship with this connection with this tiny little girl. But the problem is they just look too scary. They look scaly and their skin almost looks slimy. We just can't make it work. And the engineer went, do you know what? We've just written a program which will individually animate pieces of hair. And because of that, rather than having someone who's scaly and slimy, we have Sully from Monsters Inc., who's fluffy and blue and has this beautiful relationship with the toddler Boo. And then there was a computer engineer who was boasting about the fact that they'd just written a program that allowed us to properly animate the surface tension of water. And because of that, we have those wonderful scenes where Nemo's dad, Marlin, breaks the surface of the water to talk to seagulls and sea lions and a very, very lippy crab. And none of that would have happened if we didn't have that collaboration and that teamwork of people coming together. So we know that all great achievement in both business and personal life has to be based on teamwork, and it has to be based on working together. But here's the thing, working together is rewarding. And I'm going to tell you a quick story about two. Now, I don't know if these are crocodiles or alligators. Can anyone write in the chat bar how you tell the difference between a crocodile and an alligator? Can anyone tell me? Let's see. Someone knows. I just saw someone jump towards the chat bar. Does anyone know the difference? I don't know, but that's a crocodile. Okay, someone's told me it's a crocodile. That's good. So officially, how you tell the difference is when you leave them, you say, see you later to one of them and in a while to the other. That's how you tell the difference. So you've got the two crocodiles sitting at the side of a stream, and there's a big bit of carrion, basically a dead animals floating down the stream. Both crocodiles see this, they catch scent of their next meal, and they set off into the river. Now, the larger, faster crocodile gets there first, and the smaller one, recognizing that they have dominance, turns away and goes without a meal. But you see, they are acting purely on instinct. The larger crocodile has no regard for the fact that the smaller crocodile has missed out on a meal. And the smaller crocodile does not bear any grudge towards the larger crocodile. They are operating off their lizard brain, their really primitive brain that only looks after the instincts of survival. But here's the thing, we're a bit more evolved than that. And we haven't got armored skin, and we haven't got rows and rows of pointy teeth, but yet somehow we've become the dominant species on this planet. And the reason being is we are inherently pack animals. We want to be part of something. And when we become part of something, when we work together, we can overcome almost anything. We can hunt animals much bigger than us. We can build villages. We can create agriculture. You see, we are inherently pack animals. And I know what you're going to say. You're going to say that there are examples out there in the world of these alpha predators, these alpha people that are lone wolves, and they love doing stuff on their own. And I can't think of an example of who that could be, but I'm sure one will come to us at some point. But for the rest of us mere mortals, we are inherently pack animals. And it's because working together is actually rewarding for us. We have been programmed by Mother Nature to come together, and we are rewarded for doing so. So what I'm going to introduce you to now is the teamwork hormones. And the first two you may have heard of before, because you can get these on your own. The problem with getting these on your own is they can be quite dangerous. So the first one is endorphins. Now, have we got any runners on the call? Have we got any runners? Give me a wave if you're a runner. Okay, so my first question is, where are you going and who is chasing you? That's what I want to know. But you can get endorphins. Endorphins. It's called the runner's high. So it's that point where you don't think you can go any further. You hit the wall, and then all of a sudden you get a flood of almost euphoria, and you can carry on. You can run further than you ever thought you could. Now, the way that that was actually designed by our bodies is that when we were hunters and we used all of our energy to hunt down our prey, it gave us enough in the tank to get the prey back to our village. So the problem with doing that on our own at the moment is it can mask injury. So we can actually run through the signals that we're damaging our own body. There is a much, much better way of getting endorphins, and that is by laughing. So when we surround ourselves with people we like and we begin to laugh, we release endorphins. And has anyone ever laughed so hard that your ribs begin to hurt? Well, let me tell you, your ribs were always hurting, but the endorphins wore off, and then you suddenly realize, oh, I've got a bit of a stitch. But laughing with friends is a great way of releasing endorphins. The next one that you can get on your own is dopamine. Now, fascinates me. This was originally awarded for the gathering side of our hunter-gatherer society. So when we saw a fruit tree in the distance and we knew that there was food there, every time we looked up and we were going in the right direction, a little shot of dopamine was released, and it kept us on the right path. The problem is nowadays that's known as the gambler's hormone, or even more dangerous, it's the social media hormone. So when we put out a post on social media and then we're constantly checking our phones to see if people have liked it, if they've commented it, shared, that's because every time someone does, we get a little shot of dopamine. However, when we achieve small goals as part of a team, we also get a shot of dopamine. And you might be able to do that. So when you've got a to-do list, who keeps a to-do list? Right? So you keep a to-do list. Every time you tick something off a to-do list, you feel really good about yourself, don't you? So I know none of you do this because none of you are as petty as me, but sometimes I forget to put things on my to-do list. I do it anyway. Then I write it in just so I can tick it off. So Fiona is nodding away there. So yeah, absolutely. But that's because you get a shot of dopamine. So they're brilliant ways of doing it. So if you have a shared to-do list, if you share your to-do list with your team or those around you, if you're working towards common goals and you incrementally get there, you get a massive amount of dopamine, and it's so rewarding. Now, interestingly, the next two, serotonin and oxytocin, you can only get as part of a team, as part of a community, as part of a tribe. Serotonin is what I like to call the Oscar hormone. So when you see people receiving awards and they stand up there and they thank their mum, their dad, the person who babysat the cat for them, that is serotonin. And what's amazing about serotonin is it's two ways. So I'll thank Rick for all of his support on my journey and thanks for getting me there. And Rick will get a shot of serotonin as well. And it reinforces the bond between two people. And then if there was ever a giver's gain hormone, it would be oxytocin. So oxytocin is released when we perform an act of giving or an act of kindness for someone else. So if you see someone carrying a stack of papers and the wind catches him and they go everywhere and you stop to help them pick him up, you get a shot of oxytocin. If you let someone go out in traffic from a side turning, you feel quite good about yourself, especially when they do the flashy thing with the indicators, you get a shot of oxytocin. And what's amazing about oxytocin is it's actually contagious. So the next time you're sat in traffic and you let someone out in front of you, follow them a bit down the road and you'll find that they will stop and let someone out of the side turning in front of them. And that's because they've had a shot of oxytocin and they're feeling great about themselves. Now, wouldn't it be amazing if we could get all of these from something that we do regularly? So what about an activity where we're having fun, we're achieving goals, where we feel part of a team, and we're also helping those around us achieve their goals as well. Well, that's as near as damn it to a chapter meeting as I've ever seen described. That's why being part of a team is so important, and that coming together is so rewarding for us, because we are pack animals and we want to be part of something. And when that member stands up and gives a testimonial of what BNI has done for them, I started off, I was worried about going under. Now I've got my very best client. We've just taken on a new member of staff. We've got a van, we bought premises. We get a lump in our throat because we know we've been part of that common achievement. Teamwork is one of the most rewarding things we can ever do. And you see NASA continue to realize this with just rudimentary banners like this one that were put up. You imagine the amount of technology they had in NASA. I mean, they could have had robots heralding this message, but they just use very simple messaging and banners at their mission controls to herald the message of teamwork. And one of their employees, Katherine Johnson, who was the subject of the 2019 movie Hidden Figures, saw how powerful coming together could be firsthand. You see, in the 60s, during the moon landing, during the Apollo missions, she was one of a team of African-American female NASA employees. But she wasn't just an employee. She was a high-level mathematician. So she would hand calculate all of the trajectories, the vectors, the fuel loadings, the thrust needed to get the Apollo missions to the moon and back safely. But the problem is every time that she wrote a report, every time she did some calculations, she had to go and give it to one of her colleagues whose only qualification was that they looked like me. They were white and they were male. Until one day, all of her colleagues refused to sign off her report for their supervisor. And they said, no, if you want this signed off in time, Catherine's going to have to put her name to it. And for the first time, Katherine signed her own name on her own work, and it blew down the walls of oppression at NASA. She became valued as one of the most impactful employees in NASA of all time. So much so that there's now a computer lab named after her at Harvard. She was also awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. But the award that she valued most, one that she actually took to her grave with her, was the Silver Snoopy Award. A tiny silver lapel pin, which was actually worn on the space flight suit of an astronaut as they went into orbit. And they were giving absolute free rein of awarding that lapel pin to the employee that they believed symbolized the intent and spirit of space flight. And this was awarded to Katherine by Leland D. Melvin, himself an African-American, an astronaut who knew that without her groundwork, without her contribution, he would never have realized his dream. Because she was, after all, the mathematician who calculated all of the vectors to get the ill-fated Apollo 13 mission back safely. And you see, there was a lot of change in the 60s, as well as NASA leveling the playing field in terms of the workplace. There were leaders in our society, leaders in the American community, trying to do the same for everyone. And Dr. Martin Luther King led 250,000 people on a march into Washington where they heard him deliver his "I Have a Dream" speech. And what's amazing about the "I Have a Dream" speech is, even though he wrote it in the first person, I have a dream, he was speaking on behalf of every repressed person in America at that point. And those words resonated with someone that we've met before, JFK. He was watching on eagerly from the Oval Office. And he said to his Vice President, Lyndon B. Johnson, and all of the White House staff, we should invite these guys in. We need to do something. The public will get behind us if we endorse these guys. And he was advised against it by all of his staff, but he went against his vice president. He went against his White House advisors, and he invited the leaders of the civil rights movement into the Oval Office, and in front of paparazzi and TV cameras, he shook their hand. And what it did was legitimize their position for the very first time. And from that, they sat down and they drew up the basics of the Civil Rights Act in America, in itself known as one of the greatest human achievements of the 20th century. And I thought, wow, so out of the 3 stories that I managed to find about how people have come together and worked towards a common goal, JFK was part of 2 of them. How amazing must he have felt when the Civil Rights Act went through and the moon landings happened? Unfortunately, however much I would love it to be the case, we don't actually live in a Disney fairy tale. And on the 22nd of November 1963, whilst traveling in the last ever open-top presidential convoy, JFK was assassinated. At the time, the American public had got cold feet about the moon landings. They had no desire to vote on or to form a Civil Rights Act. But Lyndon B. Johnson, now president, picked up the tatters of the bill and pushed it through a divided Congress. And in 1964, this landmark piece of legislation went through. And the moon landings became JFK's legacy. Whereas there were worries about timing and budget, that all stopped and it became a non-negotiable. So in 1969, hundreds of thousands of people from around the world, including that young Steve Jobs, heard Neil Armstrong say, "This is one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind." And I wondered just what inspired JFK to have such a focus on teamwork, to have the foresight to go into an organization like NASA, knowing that they would herald his vision, to risk his political career, to invite what essentially could have been classed as a terrorist organization into the Oval Office and legitimize their plight with a simple handshake. So I pulled up a picture of JFK's desk from about the time where he was assassinated. And something caught my eye. You see, on a mahogany turned base, encased in resin, was a coconut shell. A coconut shell which was hand-scribed by Lieutenant John Fitzgerald Kennedy, or Jack to his friends. You see, JFK never forgot how powerful teamwork can be and how every small act pays huge returns in the long run. And we've got our own message that we herald in BNI, and that's in BNI ensures that together everybody remembers that ongoing greatness equates to helping everyone regardless. But wow, that's far too long to scribe on a coconut shell. So in BNI, we just remember that we are better together. Thank you very much.